Good morning. Does that sound good?
Yeah.
Yeah, well, I spent a good part of my career studying language evolution, along with cognitive evolution of other things like music and speech. And as Professor Chomsky reminded us 2 nights ago, language evolution has kind of a bad reputation. He says 99% fairy tales. I'm not sure where he got that exact number. He did contribute a fairy tale of his own. And to some extent, that's justified. What I want to do today is show you that we don't have to be stuck with fairy tales. I think that our job as scientists is to basically turn what sort of it's not loud enough. You guys hear me in the back?
That's good.
Good. Our job as scientists is to turn fairy tales into hypotheses, and then more importantly, to test hypotheses. So that's what I want to show you today. And I'm going to start with some examples that are relatively far from our core topic here, but then move on to probably the evolution of syntax that I think we've made some progress in. So the approach, the sort of programmatic aspect of this is what my colleagues and I have been calling cognitive biology. The goal of this is basically to build bridges between the biological sciences and the classical cognitive sciences. And it's a sad fact that basically the cognitive revolution, which happened in the 1960s and 1970s for humans, still is incomplete in the domain of animals. And there are still plenty of scholars who are not happy to talk about animal minds. They may allow chimpanzees to have minds, but you start talking about birds or fish, they get very uncomfortable. And I think it's our job as cognitive science. Well, it's my job as someone trained in cognitive science to get over that, because of course our minds came at a very deep evolutionary basis. That's one of the points that I want to make, just how deep that is. And we still have quite a lot of work to do, I think, building these bridges. In the days of Darwin and James, basically they wouldn't have made these distinctions between biologists and psychologists. I think now those lines have been rather hard. This is Conrad Lorentz, this is Nico Tinbergen, we'll be talking about. I think recognizes those two guys. So one of the things that got me into this whole area is reading evolutionary psychology and looking at the way people were doing language evolution research. And as a biologist, it really struck me as just the wrong approach. So just to choose 3 very prominent evolutionary psychologists, the basic idea of Tubia Cosmides, and now we're talking about hundreds of labs around the world that buy into this way of thinking, is that basically we can think about the human mind as a highly modular group of specializations that evolved during the Pleistocene. So since our split from chimpanzees. And the way we study this is basically to talk about what the adaptive function of these mechanisms was in the Pleistocene. And we do experiments in modern times, but if our experiments on modern humans don't work, we just say, hey, we're adapted to the Pleistocene, we're not adapted to the human. And I find that whole approach, I mean, the hypotheses are often very good, but I find that approach to testing the hypotheses really just simply incomplete from a biological point of view. So there's nothing wrong with generating these hypotheses, but we have to figure out how to test them. So that's the first thing that I'm going to react against. The second is the focus on adaptation to the near exclusion of many other things. So this is Nico Tinbergen, who published a paper in 1963 suggesting that a lot of ink had been shed by contrasting different answers to the question why. So if we take a blackbird, like the one singing outside of my room, and we ask why does it sing, there's a lot of answers to that question, and they're all part of a full biological understanding. So one answer would be, oh, it has a syrinx, it has this organ that allows it to create sound. Another would be that it has these neural mechanisms, partly innate, partly learned, that enable it to control that mechanism. Development will play a very important role. Lots of birds need to learn their songs. We can tell an evolutionary story as well, a phylogeny of different birds, which ones are vocal nerves. And of course, the adaptive function that songs function to defend territories and attract mates. That's also part of the story, but that's not the exclusive part of the story. So focusing on all of these whys at the same time is, I think, a central part of what we need to do when we think biological approach to understand the evolution of cognition in any species. I think I better just get some things clear right now in terms of definitions. A lot of people hate the word innate and hate the word instinct. There's a long tradition of using this. Darwin used both of these words freely. All I mean when I say innate is that it develops reliably. So biological traits that develop reliably. So I don't mean that it's unconscious. I don't mean that it's reflexive and inflexible. And all I mean when I say instinct is those behavioral traits that are innate. So having 5 fingers is innate. Having an instinct to learn language is also innate. That's behavior. I think the notion of instincts to learn is one that I'm really trying to sell this, because I know that a lot of people find that to be almost impossible, like as if that's a crazy concept, that there's an instinct to learn. Of course, that's all of the complex human cultural stuff that we do derives from instincts to learn. We don't have a music instinct. We're not born singing Itsy Bitsy Spider, nor are we born knowing dog. But we do have this very strong propensity to absorb those things. So the term instinct to learn is one that Pierre popularized in the context of birdsong. I think it's perfectly appropriate to use that for human evolution. And these instincts to learn can both have a positive aspect, what you pay attention to, kind of what jumps out of the environment at you, but also constraints about the kinds of hypotheses that you're able to form. Both of those important aspects of instinct. There is a 5th question. So these are called the 4 whys. Mechanism, ontogeny, phylogeny, and function. That's like the classic 4 questions of Tinbergen. But there's a 5th question that Tinbergen actually didn't talk about much, because Tinbergen didn't like to talk about learning very much. But we know, for example, from human language or from birdsong, that there's also a cultural process, a process of transmission. Whenever you have social learning, you have the possibility for, you have the fact of cultural transmission, and the possibility for cumulative culture, which in our species is incredibly important. I think it's important to add this 5th question. Another explanation for why the blackbird sings the particular song that it did is because it heard other birds when it was a baby singing songs around it. That's why Dutch blackbirds sing differently from Scottish Viennese blackbirds. Okay? So the other core plank of the cognitive biological approach, if you like, that separates it from evolutionary psychology is the recognition that we have in our brains, in our bodies, homologies that go incredibly deep. So if we're talking about DNA, it goes all the way back to the ancestral single-celled organism. If we're talking about ears, as we'll talk about in a moment, it's something shared with all vertebrates. If we talk about, say, our specific color vision, it's only shared with a few primates. But in any case, when we approach something, we have to take a very broad comparative approach and ask, okay, how deep does it go, or how widely is it shared? And taking that approach allows us to, I think, test a lot of evolutionary hypotheses. Okay, so I've just explained the difference between cognitive biology versus this evolutionary psychology approach, and what I'm going to do for the rest of the talk is illustrate that with a couple of examples. These are different than the ones that I put in my abstract, because Mark Easy gave me a very nice example, so I scrambled this a little bit. So I'm going to say a bit about color vision and then talk about audition in vertebrates and show how we can test ideas like the ones that Mark advanced by taking a broad comparative approach. Then I want to get to the core of my talk, which is syntax and testing the superregular hypothesis of George Miller, which is about context-free and floating state vertebra, so that linguists should stay awake for that part. And I'll just say a few words about recursion. I want to show you some experiments we're doing. I'm interested in. Okay, so color vision is just as a starter example. If we look around the animal kingdom, we find that some organisms are trichromatic, like us, and other organisms are dichromatic, like our friends the dogs and goats. And in fact, most mammals are dichromatic. And now when we turn to birds, say a blackbird, we find that they're at least trichromatic. And in some cases, they actually have 4 colors. So they have color vision. When we just look at that pattern of data, we have really no way of saying whether this is an example of convergent evolution that's happened in primates, that's also happened in birds, or whether there was a homology there, a deep homology going back to the ancestor of mammals and birds. So how do we find that out? Well, the first thing we do is we cast the net in the labyrinth, we look at other species. And what we find is that birds, reptiles, amphibians, and primates all have color vision, at least trichromacy. And it's actually mammals who are the outliers. And what that allows us to do is rebuild, what we know is that the ancestral vertebrate had color vision, at least 3 code types. And then in mammalian evolution, that's lost. So most mammals lack it, they only have 2 code types. And then it was actually rediscovered in our primate lineage. So whole world monkeys and apes basically had a gene duplication that led to the rebirth of color vision in our lineage. Okay? So, and that's what we can do when we take a broad comparative approach and we have enough data. Actually rebuild this evolutionary history. We're never going to find fossils of that, so we're never going to find fossil rods and cones, but we do have fossils of the DNA, and all of the genetic data is consistent with the story that you You could have just done this purely based on behavior, but we also have confirmation of that from the genetic data. Okay, so hopefully that makes the basic approach clear and very non-controversial. This color vision is something that's innate. I think there's no argument about it. We don't develop our 3D glasses. Okay, so let's take something slightly more, well, controversial. So the evolution of hearing. So I would argue that we can take exactly the same approach that I just did with color vision and rebuild the history of hearing in the vertebrates. And here's what we get. If we look at a lot of different things, I won't go through all the details, but basically all vertebrates share the fundamentals of the hearing system. We share hair cells, we share cochlea, stapes, tympanum, pitch perception, Lombard effect. Sorry, I should have said all vertebrates. Fish don't have tympanum. They're all tetrapods, all the terrestrial vertebrates share these. So that allows us to reconstruct in some ancient Devonian swamp. We already had ears. Okay? We already had the stapes that connects them to the cochlea that has hair cells and is connected by the same neural basis to the same areas of the brain, the cochlear nucleus of the brain. This is very deep and ancient stuff. That's what we use when we listen to speech. Okay. Is there anything that's special about us? Well, if you look at mammals, you find that we actually, as mammals, have evolved some other neat traits. So, for example, in our hair cells, we have 3 bones in our middle ear that gives us more control, and we have particularly good high-frequency hearing. And this provides us a clue for why all this stuff evolved in the first place. So, hypothesis 1 would be the one that Mark Easy told you about, that this is basically about listening to the environment. I want to suggest that instead, these traits all evolved in the context of listening to conspecific vocalizations. So, piece of evidence 1, if we look at mammals versus reptiles, amphibians, and birds, sometime probably in the Triassic, mammals evolved these tricks, these additional things that I just showed you that all mammals possess, and they push our hearing range up in order of magnitude. What that means is that most mammals can hear lots of sounds that their predators cannot do. In particular, things like mice and rats can produce sounds at 50 kilohertz that no bird, reptile, or snake can hear. Okay? Very nice trick. Why? Because they produce sounds at that same frequency. So what they've evolved is a private communication channel. So they produce these ultrasonic calls, they can hear them, and it's basically like their own private jam-free radio channel that they can communicate with. Okay? That's one example of many that I won't have time to go into that I think illustrate the idea. Most of this stuff evolved in the context of listening to others. Now there's another species, unfortunately for mice, there's another species that also can hear that high, namely cats. Why did they evolve that? Not because they make these vocalizations, because it's very handy to be able to hear little mice babies. Okay? So, if we look at auditory perception from a more cognitive point of view, there are 2 things that really stand out in comparative. One is that basically we go around listening for frequency, for pitched sounds. We listen for periodic sounds. So I think it's important to ask, what sounds make our periodic in the environment? If you think about it, it's all things that are made by other animals. There's only organisms can go or Bells don't do that. Objects don't do that. Physical objects taken together don't do that. So I think
echoes periodic.
Well, they won't have a fixed frequency. So you can, if you bang something, or if you clap your hands in an echo, you will hear a periodic sound that dies out very quickly. So sustained pitch is. So if I can think of, only organisms can do that. So I think this aspect of our auditory cognition evolved in the context of trying to listen for other organisms, whether conspecifics or heterospecifics. Better. A more recent advance in our understanding of auditory cognition from a comparative perspective is about formant frequencies. So for a long time, people know that formants are very important in speech. For a long time, people thought that basically animals didn't have formants, or listen to formants, or perceive formants. But a lot of research in the last 20 years has shown that actually formant frequencies are a crucial part of animal voice perception, and that they use them to pull out traits of other organisms, for example, their size or their identity. So all of this says to me, when we take a broad comparative approach, we can get a picture of the evolution of our hearing systems, which suggests very deep roots. This stuff didn't evolve in the Pleistocene. This evolved in the Devonian and the Triassic. Hundreds of millions, 300 million years of evolution. Okay? And we can unpack that kind of argument by using this comparative approach. Okay, so now, so whenever possible, take a broad comparative approach. We use the comparative method, and I've just shown you how we can do that with vision and audition. And the linguist will be thinking, okay, great, that's fine for color vision, but what about language? Language, we don't have lots of species, we don't have thousands of species we should share. So what I think, the only way to approach the fact that animals don't have language, we do, we want to talk about the evolution of language, is to break it down into multiple component parts. As soon as we do that, we realize that underlying our capacity for language are many mechanisms which are shared with other organisms. So for example, our ability to make sounds, our ability to perceive sounds, all of this stuff about formants and tongues and larynx, all that stuff is deeply shared. So that's about speech and about language. But also when we start talking about serial ordering, memory, working memory constraints, that stuff we can also study from looking at other animals. Things like pragmatics, I think the kind of work that Pierre has been doing on natural pedagogy points in the direction of something that may be unique to our species. But even there, we can study that by looking at similar mechanisms. And then, of course, the million-dollar question is about syntax. To what extent can we find animal syntax? So if we take all of these mechanisms, this makes up the faculty of language in the broad sense, and we're of course interested in knowing what aspects of that are specific to language, specific to our species. A lot of comparative work that I won't have time to go into suggests that there are at least 3 things that differentiate us from chimpanzees that have evolved in the last 6 million years. I've called them the 3 S's for signal, syntax, and semantics. Signaling meaning the ability to control our voice, so not our ears or our larynx, but our motor control and our ability to imitate sensations. Semantics meaning, well, a large number of things, but mainly this notion of theory of mind, natural pedagogy, cultural being, the attention to culturally transmitted objects. And then syntax, and I think there's quite a lot of data that for example, Comte's utterances or Gibbon's utterances don't have the kind of syntax of language. And I want to try to flesh out, just focusing on syntax, I want to try to flesh that out and show you how we can use broad comparative data to really test these hypotheses. Okay. So the basic underlying idea is that perceptual, or the ability to perceive hierarchical structures, complex hierarchical structures, is something that humans are really good at. That must be cross-modal because we can do it both in sign and in speech. I would suggest that it might be much more broad than that, so it would include things like music or even our decorative art, so the kinds of patterns we create visually. That's a hypothesis, but the underlying idea is we want to focus in on this aspect of complex hierarchical structures and how we can build it out of any kind of signals, whether it be auditory or visual. And the kind of roadmap that we've been using in learning research to look at this is the theory of computation. It started in mathematics with people like Turing. Noam Chomsky made very important contributions to this, logicians like Laney, and now it's basically a standard part of the computer science curriculum all over the place. It's also the base of a lot of computational linguistics, and there's probably people in this room who know more about this than I do, so I'm not going to go into all the details. What we do know from a lot of computational linguistics is that human languages, human natural languages, basically are at this level. I'll explain a bit more about what these levels are. Basically, this is finite state grammars, context-free grammars, context-sensitive grammars, and recursively enumerable grammars. This outer ring represents anything that's computable in a Turing sense. That's the Turing machines can do anything within this big circle. This inner level basically represents sequencing and the ability to group things together. It has discrete infinity, but it can't, and Chomsky showed this back in 1957, it can't do things that human language can do. And I'll give some examples of that in a second. Okay? So this is the theory of computation. It's the subset called formal language theory, and it's textbook material. So I'm just going to help myself to this as a biologist, not trying to invent it. I'm not trying to do what here. These guys are big workflows. So my question as a biologist is, okay, great, humans are out here. What about other animals? And of course, we can't use grammaticality judgments. I can't ask monkeys, is this a grammatical sentence or not? So we have to think of other tricks to do that. And one of the ways, and the key hypothesis that we want to test here with this animal work is basically the idea that humans are beyond this, what's called regular grammar, finite state grammars, beyond this innermost circle. So we have capacities that allows us to learn patterns beyond this, and that animals may be trapped within this level. And that idea has a very long history. It goes back to George Miller in the 1950s. As soon as he started working with Chomsky, they came up with this realization, which then Miller tested quite extensively in his lab at Harvard, that basically humans aren't only capable of building regular or finite state grammars, they prefer to. So given a choice, we'll go hierarchical. We'll impose hierarchical structure on something, even if it's not the only way to do it. So that's an argument about humans. And as I said, Chomsky showed that you can't do language with a subregular system. But he didn't say anything about music or art or anything else. And I want to suggest that Miller's hypothesis can be broadened and say basically this applies to everything that we do. We try and find hierarchy. We try and figure out a superregular grammar for everything that we perceive. And then the question is, what about it? How do we test that? Well, we started, a lot of this work that I'm going to tell you about has been focused on two very simple grammars. One is called AD to the N, and that's provably a finite state grammar, a quite simple one, where basically you have sequences of ABs, and those are strung together, and that's it. There's no more pattern than that. In order to recognize such a grammar, you only need to know about transitions from state to state. So it's a very nice, simple finite state grammar. And the contrast with that is made of the same A's and B's, and everything would be the same length. It's called A to the N, B to the N, and all this means is the number of A's must be matched by the number of B's. Okay? We're going to ask animals to perceive that. We start, of course, by asking humans whether they can do that, and all of this data, there's now many, many studies from about 10 different labs that confirm Miller's basic idea that this is no problem for human beings. And then the question, we use this grammar in a sense to prove that our system works, to prove that our technique works. So the contrast between these two grammars is going to be our crucial element. So let me show you what these things sound like. Some of you will have already heard these. So I'm going to play you from our first human and monkey experiments. These are A, B, B, and C.
Ba, bi,
Do,
yo,
Nu,
wu,
Ka,
la,
Li,
yo,
Li,
tu,
Mo,
ba,
Ku,
ba,
Ku,
mi,
Do. Okay, everybody get the idea? Males, the woman is A, the male is B. The syllables are not shared; they're basically randomized, and the order there is quite clear. So what we do in these experiments with humans and with animals is play a bunch of sounds like this. You just heard, say, if you're a human, 3 minutes. If you're 25 minutes of things like this.
yo,
Li,
tu,
Mo,
ba,
Ku. And now we play a set of test sounds that either have this. This would be one novel sound that we play.
yo,
Ka,
wu,
Li. Okay, and you're supposed to say, is that similar to or different from the others? Or sounds like this.
ba, la, no,
Nu, Pa, Mo,
di, yo,
Ku, Do. Okay, so those last two were A to the N, B to the N. And for us, it's pretty trivial to say, yeah, these guys are different from all the stuff that we've heard before. That's something that people find laughably easy, that humans find laughably easy. There's a bunch of tests that we need to do, and I won't go into all of them. Oops, I think I misplaced my method slide there. I'll come back to this. There's a lot of controls that we have to do when we're trying to show that someone learned this particular grammar. This one that I just showed you is the simplest. It was the simpler task. Did you learn the finite state grammar? Okay. So what we found with humans is that they have no problem. So we do the same approach with either the finite state or the regular or the superregular grammar. And we find that humans have no problem distinguishing violations from consistent patterns when we present these kinds of sounds. With the monkeys, they don't use a mouse. They sit in a room. They're hearing these, and we record their propensity to look to a test sound. And what we find is that they look at violations more often than they look at non-violations. And when we do this, where the underlying grammar is regular grammar, we do it. Unfortunately, when we play with this phrase structure grammar, this highly super-regular grammar, they're a chance. They can't distinguish between these different structures. So this is first evidence consistent with the idea that there's a limitation on monkeys in terms of perceiving these hierarchical structures. And that's what we're finding so far with chimpanzees. This is unpublished work now. This is a very solid result, so we know that chimpanzees are able to distinguish these finite state grammars. What I'm not convinced about yet is this, because we haven't done these in the exact same way that we did that. But so far the evidence is looking the same with chimpanzees as it is with tamarins, suggesting that primates really might be. So what we concluded when we wrote this up was tamarins are unable to process a simple phrase structure grammar, where phrase structure grammar is defined as a superregular grammar, anything beyond the finite state. But it is quite unfortunate, it's one of my deep disappointments in my scientific career, that this paper was published in Science, and at the same time, and so we didn't mention recursion at all. This is a search on our you have for recursion. But David Premack wrote the commentary, the kind of news and views for the same article, and he basically says, we showed that monkeys can't be recursion. It's all about recursion, recursion, recursion. And that's just wrong. So we didn't say that. We claim that A to the n, B to the n is not a test for recursion. As I said, it's a test for super-rated programmers. Okay? But nonetheless, this has led to just kind of endless debates about this is a test for recursion. I won't go into details, I'm sure, before almost everyone here. There's a lot of different ways you can solve this task. There's a lot of different ways you can do A to the n, B to the n. These are three, the three sort of most prominent. We know that humans can do all three of these. Okay? This is the simplest. This is actually beyond, it's even a higher level of power than context-free grammars. It requires context-sensitive grammars. But we know from training studies that humans can do all of them. But the key thing, as far as testing Miller's hypothesis, is that they're all super random. You can't do any of these things without having something in addition to a finite state grammar. This can be as simple as a simple counter. So we can think of it, everything is built on a finite state grammar plus x. And plus x could be a counter. Or actually two counters, so you need to count both and then compare them. It could be a crossing off of one of the others. So you cross this one off, you get that one, cross this off. It might be a center embedding interpretation. Or you cross these off like that. And this requires a push-down stack. This requires a table. Details. They're all possible. Humans can do all of them. And all of our data suggests that monkeys can do none of them. It's not because monkeys can't count. We know that monkeys can summatize up to at least 3. So that's not the problem. The problem seems to be counting and comparing. So having 2 counts of one and comparing those 2. Okay. So in order to really prove that an organism gets A to the n, B to the n, you have to exclude various other hypotheses. One of the most obvious hypotheses is what we call the A to the n, B to the n, or A star, B star. All this means is a bunch of A's followed by some number of B's, they don't have to touch. Okay? That's a finite state grammar. So this is kind of inverting what I showed you before. The hypothesis, the finite state grammar hypothesis, has a lot of things in it other than A to the n, B to the n. But all A to the n, B to the n strings are included within this hypothesis. Okay? So it's kind of an interesting question. Why, when we hear all these things where there's 2 A's and 2 B's, 3 A's and 3 B's, why don't we just assume it's a bunch of A's followed by a bunch of B's? Why do we jump to the conclusion, based on this only positive data, that these 2 must match? That's kind of weird, right? But the crucial thing, if we want to show that you got that, we have to exclude those. We have to be able to exclude places where the n and the m are not matches. And this is where we get into the bird results. So after we published this years later, Tinbergen and his colleagues came up with a study with starlings using quite similar techniques, except not using starling vocalizations instead of human vocalizations. And with 50,000 to 100,000 training trials, the starlings were apparently able to solve this A to the n, B to the n, and exclude unmatched A's and B's. Okay, so this was published in Nature. Unfortunately, they jumped on the recursion bandwagon and said this is proof that birds have recursion. Like he's already said, it's nonsense. And gender, he's convinced that that's nonsense. Okay, unfortunately, and that would be great. I would love it. Because it would be really nice to have an animal system where we can study hierarchical structure of the sort, and where we can do the full range of things that we can do with birds, and be able to study something that I think is at the center of human beings. But unfortunately, a contingent of people here in Holland, actually right here in Leiden, and his colleagues, published a paper in 2009 duplicating the Gentner results with zebra finches, and then showed why actually that experimental design can't allow you to include Indian because they lump together all their birds. So actually what they concluded is that different birds have different techniques. If you combine all the birds, and all those techniques are finite state, if you combine all of those birds, you get something that looks like success on the A to the n, B to the n task, but actually can be explained with less of the birds. And of course, there have been accusations and counter-accusations. There's about 10 papers in this. There's another set of papers that I won't go into. But basically, right now, both of the attempts to show birds going beyond the finite state have received quite telling critiques. We have to leave a question mark. Scientists have to do all, but it doesn't look too good for the birds. So the audit. Shit.
So we're ready to stop. Sweet.
Okay. Okay. I can't stop just yet. So give me 3 more minutes. I'm going to do this very quickly. So it's a bit unfair to animals to ask them to do vocalizations of human beings, right? So what we've been doing in my lab recently is using these abstract visual patterns like this, where we can do exactly the same things, build AD to the AD and read grammars and what have you. But now there's no working memory constraints. So all you have to do to recognize something like this is go, it's symmetrical. That one, we have these little groups like that. That should be a much fairer, and they're equally meaningless there. Right? They don't mean anything to humans, they don't mean anything to birds. And so we've been doing this now with 2 different species, small-brained pigeons and large-brained parrots. And we've done lots of different controls to show what they can generalize to. And the key is, in particular, these smart guys can generalize to a lot of stuff. But unfortunately, in both cases, they completely fail at these foil stimuli. So they are not able to recognize the difference between A to the M, B to the N, and A to the M, B to the M, even with intensive training. So even with, and this seems so easy to a human. You look at this and it's just, oh, it's symmetrical. This is actually consistent with a lot of data that we have from pigeons in particular, that symmetry is actually a very difficult thing for pigeons. It's not something that just sort of falls out. That's a natural thing for pigeons to do, which goes against our intuitions because it seems so obvious and so straightforward. Okay, so none of our birds were able to do this. This is consistent with the primate results, and so what we have right now, when we try and plug animals like this, is a bunch of birds who can do, a bunch of animals who can do finite state, and who can't go beyond it. One question mark case being the birds, and abundant evidence that humans find this very easily. Okay, so that leads to a bit of a twist on the superregular hypothesis. I'm calling it metrophilia, but I'm looking for new names for it. It's just a term. This is basically that humans have this propensity to build superregular grammars. It's domain general, and that it applies not only to speech type sounds, but any kind of patterns that we can look at, including these abstract visual patterns. And that this is something that animals don't seem to have. At least it's not easy for them. Maybe they can do it, but it takes 100,000 training trials. We do this spontaneously with no feedback whatsoever. Okay? We're going to do this with a lot of other species. We're looking at this metrophilia by letting people design patterns, and we find that people are meticulously, they are unable to look at a pattern like that. This is a touch screen, and you can click these things and make patterns. People do stuff like this, and they build beautiful patterns, highly regular patterns. We don't tell them to do anything. They'll sit there for hours and do this. People really like to make patterns like that. So we can look at the production as well as the perception of this. But I just want to end, this is the experiment that I need to show you. Because now what we're trying to do here is actually get a recursion. So ask about, are you able to do self-embedding? And are you able to extend that across levels? So we use things like this. This is a very simple fractal structure. So we basically take this and then we duplicate it in a binary branching pattern. We do it again. We show people these 3 levels, and then we ask them, which one is a continuation? Which one is a good continuation? And all of you guys, being smart, recursively minded people, will recognize that this is the correct answer, this is the wrong answer. We have lots of different patterns that we do this with. And what we find is that people are very consistently able to do this. This is not a difficult task for people. It takes a long time. So it takes like 10 seconds. It'll take you serious time to get this. But if we give people the time, they don't have the problem. We also did a control to show that it's not just because this one looks prettier. So this is just a visual preference task. So we can exclude that it's just some kind of symmetry feeling or something like that. And now, Mauricio Martins, who I'm doing this with, is doing this in brain imaging and also looking at kids. So trying to figure out when kids can do this. It looks like kids are able to do this pretty early. So we've got 4-year-olds who have problems, 5-year-olds are already able to do this kind of thing. And it seems more that the task is a problem than the images themselves. This is how the first one is submitted to JPG. All right, so I hope to have shown you that we can study this stuff empirically. Language evolution doesn't have to be fairy tales. We can actually gather data. Particularly the broad comparative approach is very important for that. I think Miller's hypothesis is alive and kicking. And our data suggests that this is something that really does seem to be at least a quantitative difference between our species and all the other ones that we've tested so far. And I hope that this shows that we can actually do biology and evolution cognition in this productive and constructive way. And thanks to all the people, these are postdocs who are involved in this work, and thanks to ERC for